Northern Kurdistan. Shortly after the Turkish Republic was formed in 1923, Kurdish nationalists rebelled against the state's authority, passed laws to wipe out Kurdish history and identity. By 1924, Kurdish language education was banned. Kurdish names were forbidden. Kurdish village names were changed to Turkish ones, and Kurdish history did not appear in history books. Thus, the Kurds became deprived of all their natural rights and were called Mountain Turks. However, three major national revolts followed. The first revolt was the 1925 Sheikh Said revolt, which called for an independent Kurdistan but failed to achieve its aims. Thus, 53 of its leaders were executed. According to Kurdish sources, civilian losses amounted to the destruction of 206 villages, the burn of 8,758 houses, and the killing of 15,206 men, women, and children. In 1930, Jirko stated that more than 500,000 were deported during the winters of 1925 to 1928, and that more than 200,000 of these deportees lost their lives in the course of their forcible removal to Western Anatolia. The second revolt was the Agri Daghi Ararat Mountain Revolt in 1930 to 1931, which was organized by Khoibun independence but was suppressed by the Turkish army. The Turkish military slaughtered between 7,000 to 15,000 Kurds in less than a week in the Lan Valley. Some historians put the figure at 47,000 Kurds killed by the Turkish state terrorism. However, on May the 5th, 1932, a law ordering the deportation and dispersion of Kurds was passed. Several hundred thousand Kurds were deported to Central and Western Anatolia, and four separate categories of inhabited zones were recognized in Turkey. Zone 1 will include all those areas in which it is deemed desirable to increase the density of culturally Turkish population. This is obviously referred to Kurdistan. Zone 2 will include those areas in which it is deemed desirable to establish populations which must be assimilated into Turkish culture. Zone 3 will be territories in which culturally Turkish immigrants will be allowed to establish themselves freely but without the assistance of the authorities. The most fertile and habitable areas of Kurdistan were thus graciously offered to Turkish immigrants. Zone 4 will include all those territories which it has been decided should be evacuated and those which may be closed off for public health, material, cultural, political, strategic, or security reasons. This category included the more inaccessible areas of Kurdistan. This law led to the third revolt in Turkey in 1937, Dersim Revolution, which was led by Said Riza. The revolt started in 1937 in the mountains of Dersim and continued until the end of 1938. But the insurgents could not receive outside help and the people of Dersim were massacred, which I shall explain later. In 1960, the Turkish military staged a coup which had the backing of the educated elite to draw up a new constitution. The resulting document enshrined broad freedoms to form associations, publish, organize trade unions, and call strikes. However, coup makers discussed and implemented forced deportation of Kurds from eastern and western provinces, mass arrest, bureaucratic engineering to prevent the Kurds from becoming teachers in their own provinces. Later in 1965, the underground Kurdistan Democratic Party of Turkey was formed. This was the first nationalist Kurdish party inside Turkey since the last crushed rebellion of 1938. It called for a Kurdish federation within Turkey's borders. On March the 12th, 1971, a second coup was staged to curb left-right violence and growing feelings of nationalism among Kurds, but also to rewrite 1961 constitution. Socialist parties were charged with against communist propaganda and supporting Kurdish separatism. However, civilian rule in 1973 reignited the old divisions and violence. It was then that the PKK, led by Abdullah Öcalan, first made its appearance. On November 28, 1978, PKK was formed and called for a national revolution to overthrow the Turkish state, forward to an independent, united, democratic Kurdistan. Down with imperialism and colonialism. Long live independence and proletariat. Internationalism. Long live the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party. As Uzun puts it, in 1978, the PKK was founded as a Kurdish movement that adopted the legacy of the massacred revolutionaries of the Turkish left, based on a Marxist-Leninist theory and the strategy of a long-term people's war. It aimed at achieving an independent Kurdistan. However, on September 1980, a third coup was staged and martial law was imposed throughout Turkey. Over the next 3 years, tens of thousands of leftist Kurds and rightists would pass through the courts and prisons. Torture of detainees would become routine, and all democratic opposition would be silenced. Thus, PKK leaders Öcalan departed to Syria and arranged for PKK fighters to get training from the Palestinian militant groups in Syria and Lebanon. Between 1980 and 1982, about 300 PKK militants arrived for training. The night of March 21, 1982, the Kurdish New Year, PKK prisoner Mazlum Doğan hanged himself in protest. On May 18, 4 other PKK prisoners burned themselves. On July 14, 1982, PKK prisoners led a death fast to demand an end to abuses, and by September, 4 of the group's senior cadre had died. Even worse, the 1982 constitution stated that every citizen of Turkey was a Turk. Another named the state language as Turkish. Another said that this article could never be changed. Under the law governing political parties, it was not allowed to claim that minorities existed in Turkey, nor permitted, protect, or develop non-Turkish cultures and languages. In fact, Law 2932, which specifically banned all uses of the Kurdish language without citing the word Kurdish. From 1984 onwards, tension escalated. The PKK began its attacks inside Kurdistan. Turkish security forces reacted to PKK attacks with shows of force. A counter-insurgency campaign began. Kurds were detained on suspicion of helping the PKK. Turkish security forces created the state's village guard system and threatened to burn down people's houses if they did not join. Kurds who tried protest were accused of working for the PKK. In April 1991, Article 8 of the anti-terrorism law came into force. It made it possible to consider academics, intellectuals, and journalists speaking up peacefully for Kurdish rights to be engaging in terrorist acts. Similarly, under Article 312 of the Turkish Penal Code, mere verbal or written support for Kurdish rights could lead one to be charged with provoking hatred or animosity between groups of different religion, region, or social class. For instance, in March 1992, during the Kurdish Nowruz, Turkish security forces shot and killed some 90 demonstrators. Activist Kurds and parliamentarians showed resent about the Nowruz massacre. Later, many were abducted and killed, more than 250 that year and just over 450 the next year. Further, the 1990s counterinsurgency campaign did not part civilians, villages, and towns. In 1994, some 1,000 settlements were forcibly evacuated, compared with another 1,000 settlements emptied under mainly state pressure between 1990 and 1993. In total, somewhere between 300,000 and more than 1 million Kurds were driven out of their homes, only to crowd in shanty towns and slums in Diyarbakir and cities in the west. However, an international conspiracy led to the capture of Öcalan, and his sentence was read out on June 29, 1999. On the day Kurdish nationalist leader Sheikh Said was hanged in 1925 in Diyarbakir. Öcalan was sentenced to death. Later in prison, Öcalan had come up with something he called the Democratic Republic, which aims at ending struggling for autonomy or federation or independence. Instead, Kurds should fight for a truly democratic Turkey, in which Kurds and Turks would be unified in the way that Turkey's founder Ataturk had imagined. In 2001, Turkish apartheid constitution still considered that the people of Turkey, regardless of religion and race, are Turks with regards to Turkish citizenship. Article 88, the Turkish state, with its territory and nation, is an invisible entity. Its language is Turkish. However, in August 2002, a set of reforms were approved by Turkish parliament and Kurdish language classes were allowed finally, but only as a special after-school private classes and then only for people over the age of 18. By 2004, the Turkish parliament passed a language law, permitted limited Kurdish language broadcasts, and released 9 Kurdish deputies from prison. In August 2005, Prime Minister Erdogan declared that Turkey had a Kurdish problem, had made grave mistakes in the past, and now needed more democracy to solve the problem. His motivations were several: to appease the European Union, with which accession negotiations began in 2005, to draw Turkey's Kurdish votes away from pro-Kurdish parties and towards the AKP, and to weaken the political influence of Turkish general staff, which had been instrumental in securitizing to its Kurdish problem. However, on 11th of December 2009, the Constitutional Court banned the pro-Kurdish DTP because of its close association with the PKK. More than 1,000 DTP and other Kurdish notables were placed under arrest for their supposed support of the PKK, so the Kurdish opening seemed closed. On 21st of March 2013, at Diyarbakir's Nowruz, a message from Öcalan was read out. In his message, he referred to the common past of Turks and Kurds, asserted that they lived together under the flag of Islam and that they needed to create a common future. By July 2013, the People's Congress of Kurdistan, Kongragel, a PKK-affiliated body, declared that the first stage of the peace process had been completed by the PKK withdrawals from Turkey and was time to implement Kurdish demands, which included Öcalan release or transfer to house arrest, the abolishing of the so-called village guard system of government-sponsored and armed Kurdish citizens, the right to maintain a local self-defense force, and an amnesty for Kurdish fighters and for imprisoned activists. A reform of Turkey's notorious and wide-ranging anti-terror laws, education in Kurdish, establishing Kurdish so-called equal with Turkish as an official language of the Republic, the replacement of the current ethnic definition of citizenship with a civic one, an end to the 10% electoral hurdle for parliamentary representation, and above all, some kind of devolution, self-determination, or democratic autonomy in Turkey. However, Erdogan's democratization package announced on 30 September 2013 merely granted the following rights: established private schools for Kurdish language education, restored the Kurdish village names that had been changed into Turkish, permitted that the use of the letters Kha, Ta, Wa of the Kurdish alphabet on signposts and identification cards, granted freedom for political campaigning in Kurdish, abolished the students' daily vow of allegiance that began "I am a Turk." However, the Kurds were not satisfied with these provisions and objected to their unilateral formulation. In April, in the run-up to the June 2015 general vote, Erdogan pronounced that there is no Kurdish issue in this country. There is a problem of the PKK. Yet, the pro-Kurdish People's Democracy Party, HDP, received 13.1% of the national vote and more than doubled its parliamentary seat to 80, and AKP lost its parliamentary majority it had held since 2002. Thus, the ruling AKP forced another set of election in November of the same year. In the run-up to the election, Turkey's security forces renewed its fighting against PKK, and pro-Kurdish activities were bombed in Suruj in July 2015. City centers of Nusaybin, Jizira, and Old Diyarbakir were razed after the broken PKK Turkish ceasefire. The entire city of Shirnak was leveled. Some 2,000 people had died in the fighting. On September the 11th, 2016, Turkey's Interior Ministry announced that it was taking direct control of 25 local government municipalities in the southeast, removing the elected HDP city mayors and replacing them with government-appointed trustees. Further, in September 2016, Turkey's Education Ministry suspended 11,285 teachers from allegedly supporting Kurdish separatists. Erdogan claimed that the firing of the teachers and local mayors was part of the campaign against Kurdish terrorism. Today, HDP co-leader Salahuddin Demirtas and other HDP MPs are stripped of their parliamentary immunity and imprisoned for charges of treason.